Scripture that chronologically tell the story. So today's lectionary text comes to us from the Gospel of Luke, the physician, and today's text comes to us from the 19th chapter of his Gospel account, and it's verses 28 to 40. After he had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. When he had come near Bethphage and Bethany at the place called the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples, saying, "Go into the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks, 'Why are you untying it?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it.'" Then they brought it to Jesus, and after throwing their cloaks on the colt, they set Jesus on it. As he rode along, people kept spreading their cloaks on the road. As he was now approaching the path down from the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all of the deeds of power that they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven, and glory in the highest heaven." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, order your disciples to stop." He answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out." Friends, these are the words of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Okay, this is Palm Sunday. But given that Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, riding that donkey, given those events happened 2,000 years ago, how do we know that it happened on a Sunday? You might assume that the gospel accounts tell us, but they don't. All we have is a single clue that we find in the gospel account of John, and that clue comes actually from putting the events in two verses together. John chapter 12, verse 1 says this, says that 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany to the home of Lazarus. And John, in the same chapter 12, in the 12th verse, says that the next day, Jesus came to Jerusalem. Okay? But the start of Passover is always on the same date of the Hebrew calendar. It's the same date, not the day of the week or the third Thursday after the first of the month or any. It's the same date of the Hebrew calendar, which means that Palm Sunday could have actually been any day of the week, depending on what year the crucifixion took place, because we count the first day of the week backwards from the crucifixion. So to say that Jesus entered into the city of Jerusalem on a Sunday is largely a tradition, which is based on assumptions about the year that Jesus died. Most believe that that was the year 30 AD. And the fact that all four gospel accounts agree that the crucifixion did take place on the Friday of that week. So you put those together, and it leads us, if it's the year 30, to a Sunday. But let's not get burdened down in the details. But I do want to put this out there. The truth is that some biblical scholars have suggested that the procession into Jerusalem took place on a Monday. But what day of the week, of course, doesn't really matter, except for, and what I'd like to talk about today, the perspective of the people who rejoiced that day, whatever day that was, when Jesus rode into the city of Jerusalem. And if it was a Monday, it was a weekday, not the Sabbath, right? Which for the Hebrew people is from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. Thus, it certainly was not a holy day in the religious sense of the term. And if it was a Sunday, it still wasn't a holy day, a religious day, like Sunday is for us. Sunday would have been like our Monday, the first day of the work week, the day after the Sabbath rest, right? Time to sweep the stoop, open the shop, wash the clothes, go to market, repair the ox cart, get bread in the oven, deal with matters that were left over from the previous week that had been put aside last week when the Sabbath came, and so forth. Besides, we've got Passover coming up. There is lots to do. Regardless of the actual week, the day of the week rather, for the people who greeted Jesus as he rode into the city that day, it was a Monday-ish kind of day. For us, there's a sense in which Mondays, as the first day of the week, work week, symbolizes for us the business of life continuing, of everything resuming after a brief weekend or a Sabbath pause. Mondays reflect to us emotionally the fact that life goes on. Things get back to normal, back into whatever our routine is, the status quo. Most people find it hard to drag themselves out of bed and to work on Mondays. It's such a tribulation that the very effort to survive Mondays has become the subject of numerous songs. Many of those in the blues tradition, like T-Bone Walker and Eric Clapton, Mississippi John Hurt, Muddy Waters. Rainy days and Mondays always get me down, sang the Carpenters. Monday, Monday, can't trust that day. A Mamas and Papas hit. But for many people, particularly those with A-type personalities, Monday for them is actually a pleasure because it is a day to attack what needs to be done, to jump in with both feet, to crank things back up again. So what was Jesus doing on that day? Why would he make a gesture so dramatic that the crowds went wild praising God? It's interesting to me in today's text that the Pharisees, seeing this happen, actually asked Jesus to stop. Asked Jesus to tell people to cut it out. And by implication, reject the accolades that they were pouring upon him. What was Jesus thinking? For years, the church, the broader church, has called this event, Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry. Clearly, this was no covert operation. There was nothing black ops about it. Jesus didn't slip quietly into the city under the cover of darkness with a team of highly trained operatives whose former education and occupation involved them fishing for perch in the Sea of Galilee. No, Jesus enters into Jerusalem in plain sight on a busy workday. This was an overt operation. And why did Jesus follow it the next day with this dramatic public event, the cleansing of the temple, which he literally whipped up in a frenzy? We don't know Jesus' motivation. But it does seem that he was forcing the authorities to deal with him. Go big or go home, right? Jesus went big. Jesus, in coming into Jerusalem on that day, and the very next day, whipping up a frenzy in the temple, he was lighting a fuse that exploded later in the week with the bang of the soldiers' hammers as they drove nails into his hands and feet. Both the entry into the city and the brouhaha in the temple defy the Monday mindset. No, you can't carry on life As usual, Jesus seems to be shouting to us, "For my kingdom is not of this world." Don't lose it in the mundane of Monday. His behavior doesn't make sense, right? Usually Jesus chose not to be the center of attention. Often he would heal people and he would caution the excited person. Now, don't tell anybody about this. But maybe that's the point on this Palm Monday. Jesus took dramatic, out of character steps to make something happen. Not just his death, something else. Jesus forces the issue. A New Testament scholar by the name of John Dominic Crossan suggests that as Passover approached, Jesus came to Jerusalem intentionally to make two demonstrations. First, against the Roman imperial control over the city of peace. And second, against Roman imperial control over the temple. In other words, against the governor Pilate and his chosen high priest, Caiaphas. As Crossan, this scholar, explains it, Jesus intended his very public ministry entry into Jerusalem on that donkey not only as a criticism of Roman power, but to make fun of it, to lampoon it. Because people were flooding from all over the place into the city on this Passover. Pilate would have been sure to travel from his home in the ancient city of Caesarea on the Mediterranean coast. He had a nice coastal home there instead of living in the city of Jerusalem. And on that Passover, Pilate would have traveled from Caesarea into Jerusalem, bringing with him a large contingent of Roman soldiers. So Pilate would have rode into the city in advance of this Passover celebration on a powerful black war horse, bedecked with colors and banners, insignia and armor. From Caesarea, he would have driven right through the western or Jaffa Gate in Jerusalem. That is the city's front door. Jesus arrives on a donkey. On the opposite side of the city, through the eastern gate. It's called the Golden Gate, but don't let the Golden Gate part fool you. This was the back door of the city. All four Gospels tell the Palm Monday story. And the lectionary's choice for this year, its text comes from the Gospel according to Luke. But in Matthew's version, Matthew actually adds a comment that Jesus' action in choosing to ride a donkey with her colt fulfills the words of the prophet from the Hebrew Scriptures, Zechariah, which said, shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you, triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And why? Zechariah tells us why. To cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem. And the battle bow shall be cut off, and he, the Messiah, shall command peace to the nations. Let's contrast Pilate on his stallion, his war horse, with Jesus on a nursing donkey mare with her colt beside her. And if you can do that, you see the intended message. Peace on earth, yes, but not peace by Romans' violent victory. Rather, peace by God's nonviolent justice, according to Crossan, this scholar. Likewise, Jesus also forced the issue when he created this disturbance in the temple the next day By driving the sellers and the money changers from the temple, he acted out a parable, according to Crossan. The temple was the house of God for all of the nations, but the temple and its high priest were allowed to function only under the control of Rome. And Jesus' action with the whip declared that to be unacceptable to God. Jesus, this scholar says, symbolically destroys the temple's fiscal basis by overturning the tables where monies were changed into the standard donation coinage. Is this scholar right about Jesus' intentions with these two actions? Since none of the Gospels tell us otherwise, he might as well be. But in both cases, Jesus was forcing the issue. We live in an age where a lot of issues need to be forced into the Mondays of our lives. We may not like it, but the issues have been forced, and we're compelled to address them or to ignore them. The Me Too movement has exposed the prevalence of sexual harassment and sexual assault in the workplace and other environments. I don't know if you know this, but the church has its own version. It's called Silence is Not Spiritual. Hashtag Silence is Not Spiritual. We're forced to address the issues raised by whistleblowers, employees, or insiders who become aware of wrongdoing and the dangerous practices within a corporation or an agency, even a church, and then they make that information public so it can be stopped. We can't ignore protesters who put themselves in legal jeopardy or risk physical violence to say something isn't right or fair for the common good or pleasing God, whatever political side you may be on. These are some examples, and I suppose that you can think of others. What issues would Jesus force you to consider on this Palm Monday? When Jesus rides into our lives, whether in church on a Sunday or on the street on a Monday, he forces an issue for us. He calls us to make a decision to follow him, to trust him, and maybe to confront injustice, to expose danger, or to challenge arrogance over our lives. Jesus rides into the Mondays of our lives, challenging the business as usual of our routines. But his question for you on this Palm Sunday is, will you follow?